In a world where even the smallest disagreements can lead to arguments, violence, and even death, two brothers tackle the difficult subjects. This podcast is not just about dissecting topics from two different perspectives. It's also about how to have conversations on difficult topics while avoiding the urge to tear someone's head off and vomit down the bloody stump of their neck.
Well, this is your show. You want to lead us off?
Sure. I noticed something in when you put the title on. The discussion that I proposed was not that capitalism is more democratic than democracy, but than our political system, than our what we've implemented in our country.
Okay.
There's all kinds of democracies out there. And I think, if we look back at the history of it, first thing to remember, I think most people know that we're a representative democracy, not a true democracy. A democracy would be very difficult to implement. It would mean that we would be required to vote on every issue that came up. I guess it would really help my cause, which is seeking a smaller government, because it would be really hard to come to terms with it or even find a way to vote for all these little things. And I think we're probably all grateful, even me, a libertarian, that we have representatives that are willing to go and take care of those issues for us. We don't want to have to be deciding about every road that's put in and how we're going to, you know, behave with other countries, foreign policy, those types of things. We're I think I'm grateful. I think most people are grateful that we have representatives that do that type of thing for us. However, a representative democracy does create certain problems. And especially in our case, I think that are exacerbated by the fact that we have only two political parties. And what I mean by that is, you said at one point in one of our previous discussions a week or two ago, well, just go and vote, however you want the government to behave. And I think that becomes very difficult in our representative democracy where we have only two political parties and such broad issues where the government has become involved in so many different things. What I mean by that is, let's say, for example, that, the big issue that people are talking about, one of the big issues people are talking about these days is college debt forgiveness, college loans. And if I disagreed with what the current decision is, well, who would I vote for? Like, how do I affect change right now? And I think, if I were to ask, if I were to ask myself, well, how do I do that? I'd have to say, okay, well, who's pulling the strings here? It seems like the president is. It seems like Congress has a lot to do with it. So if I wanted to affect that change, first of all, that change comes pretty slowly. So I'd have to say, okay, well, I want to vote for the president, which the next election isn't going to happen for a couple of years. When is the next senator? I mean, senators are elected every 6 years. So that's going to take a while to change the senators. If I disagree with the sitting senators, that the decisions they're going to make about college debt and whether they forgive it. Representatives are changed more frequently, but it's on a rolling basis. So I'd have to look at who my representatives are and then try to figure out how I can vote them out of office. When all that is said and done, I've got to wait for all that stuff to happen. So maybe it'll be a decision that's made in the future. But the other issue I run up against is maybe I vote the people that I want into office, but they're in the minority. Now, I guess that's a democracy, so maybe we'd be okay with that. But they're affecting this part of my life where I have no control over it. My money has to be given to these people. But the bigger issue that I see with this is, let's say, for example, I want student loans to not be forgiven. Well, if we have two candidates, that might mean that I have to vote for Donald Trump, which I might not feel comfortable with. Or I might vote for a candidate who agrees with me on student loans, but not on abortion, or not on foreign policy, or not on other issues. So we're having to compromise a lot of our values when we vote for certain people because these platforms that they have are so broad. Um, and the other issue, well, so let's start with that. So I don't just give you a laundry list of issues to try to remember them all when you're refuting them. But when I, if we compare that to capitalism, if I disagree If I don't want to purchase a certain product, I don't have to. I can put my money wherever I want. I can vote with my money very easily, and there's a huge number of options out there. Now, I'm not saying that we want capitalism uh, to govern our country, but we should look at the differences there. With capitalism, we can vote for whichever companies we want. If we're going to call that voting, we can support whoever we want. But with government, we're kind of pushed into these decisions where we're making difficult, compromising decisions. Am I making sense, or am I making sense of that?
Yes, you are, and it's an interesting issue to discuss. And when you mentioned it, I really had to sit down and really give some thought to what it was that you were posing. And okay, I got sort of a basic idea, a little bit of some searching online, and then you're clarifying it now, and it is a particularly interesting issue when you talk about the candidate that maybe has one issue you don't like, but you ignore, you compromise on the candidate because there's other issues that are important to you. There's some people have really big, I call them trigger issues, and I'm sure that's probably not my phrase. I'm sure other people use it. My father-in-law, big Second Amendment guy, and so that's his number one priority. He would compromise on many things in order to elect an official that is pro Second Amendment. And many people have those types of issues. For a lot of people, it's, maybe the abortion is a big one right now. For some people, freedom in business. That we need less government because we need to give the businesses the opportunity to go out and explore. And so when you have your trigger issue, of course, you have to you may find yourself in one camp on nearly everything, and then in another camp on one issue. But if that one issue is a big issue, well, then you're going to compromise everything else that you do. And it is an interesting challenge that we find. How important are these issues? If you were to, prioritize all of your issues, the issues that are not so important to you are going to get pushed aside in order to support the issues that are important to you. But what's interesting about your analogy of the company versus the government is that when you go into a store, there are lots of products that are out there in the store. And many of the products you're not going to have an interest in. To use the obvious example, you're not going to go out and buy pantyhose. And so the pantyhose being there doesn't upset you, doesn't make you angry that other people are out there buying pantyhose. And so I get where you're going with the consumer being able to use their dollars to, I guess, vote, if you want to use that comparison. But it's not a perfect analogy because of those issues. A lot of people don't drink alcohol. And so, or do you feel so strongly about not drinking alcohol that you want other people not to drink alcohol as well? And so what are you going to do to impact that environment? And so I feel like that's a better comparison to governance, to democratic and governance, because in the government, not everything applies to you. I don't have student loans. I don't know if you have student loans or not, but the student loan forgiveness that just happened doesn't really impact me, except for the fact that my money, my tax dollars, have been used to implement it. But there are other things that impacts the government makes decisions on that also doesn't impact me. When they change the EPA rules for certain high polluting companies, I may get impacted by the actual EPA rules, but I don't get impacted by the companies that are impacted, though, that have to now adhere to more stringent or less stringent rules. So I don't know. What do you think about that aspect of it?
I'm not quite sure I followed what your analogy was. You're saying it doesn't apply to capitalism in general. It only applies to the fact that, yeah, I didn't quite get what your analogy was.
Well, the consumer spends their money in the stores, but only on the things that they have an interest in consuming. When we talk about the government makes rules that apply to us, and then they also make rules that will apply to other people. The rules around immigrants don't apply to you or I. So how we some people have an interest because they feel like what's happening with the immigrants can secondarily impact us. But when you look inside a store, there's not often a secondary impact other than the fact that pantyhose being on the shelf is going to take up shelf space that might be occupied by something you want to buy. Otherwise, there really is no secondary impact.
Yeah. Yeah, I guess so. What you're saying is that because it sounded like you were saying that some of these policies that the government implements don't affect us, but people think that there's certainly people that disagree with you. I mean, the immigration issue, there's people that think it is definitely affecting our country and that the government should be concerned about it. I mean, certainly people down in Texas, Arizona, places like that have much stronger opinions about it. The EPA, there's other people that say, yeah, that's having a great effect on us, and because it affects the business, but you act as if it affects the business and not us, but that's going to affect prices, that's going to affect availability of products, it's going to affect a lot of different things. I don't know. I guess what I would say is when I look at, I mean, when you bring up that point of the fact that you can go to the store and uh, you only purchase those products that you want. You only go to those stores that you want. That is a more democratic process. We're deciding what's going to be out there as a populace. We're deciding where they're going to focus their energies, these companies. But here in the government, all these things are happening and it's all over the place. Like right now, there's plenty of people that are upset about this huge bill that passed right in the face of inflation. And they're saying it's going to cause more inflation. It's supposed to be an inflation reduction act, but it really is more about environmental issues and forgiving student loans and stuff like that, and people are thinking that it's actually going to be worse for inflation. So yeah, that's I think that kind of illustrates my point that with government, all these things happen that affect us, and the and we have no control. We have very little control over it. They're just happening. Whereas in the capitalist marketplace, if you decide you don't like pantyhose or you decide that you don't like any product, you don't have to purchase it. You have much more control. It's a much more democratic process than it is in our actual manifestation of democracy, or what is supposed to be a manifestation of democracy, which is our government. In fact, when you look at the money and power that affect decisions, those companies that we act as if they're the ones that, the evil ones that are trying to control everything. The truth of it is they can control us through the political process, but not as much through capitalism itself. Because, you look at the most powerful companies in our country, they're not charging high, like not all of them, I guess, but if you look at some of the most powerful companies in our country, Amazon, Walmart, I mean, these are cheap products that they're offering to us. Even the oil and gas companies, they're pretty cheap products. But when they go to government, that's where they can gain some control
When the
because they can,
companies go to government,
yeah, because the lobbyists, they affect legislation. You've complained numerous times about how much power that these companies have, but they gain it through government intervention, not through the marketplace.
and that's one that I would definitely agree with you on. That our government, to a degree, is a pay to play entity. Um, I can and I do occasionally write letters to my representative and say, hey, how about this issue? How about that issue? Or here's something that I have an issue with. I really have no idea if she says, round table with all her aides, hey, we've got, this Brian guy, he's got a point. We need to go and figure out how to go and implement this thing that he's talking about. But what we do see is that a lot of corporations and a lot of lobbyists are helping to actually write the laws that are implementing or that are being implemented. And so, yes, you are correct. We do have a problem with our governance, where the more money you have, the more say you have in how the government is run. On the other hand, a company cannot become a representative within the government, but you can. You can go out and you can run. And that's another difference, is that the big companies are controlled by the shareholders, not the individual shareholders, but the shareholders that have the most shares. And so it becomes a way, the people that determine how the philosophy of the company or the way that the strategy of the companies are determined by the people that have the most money, something that probably you or I will never have enough influence to be able to have an impact on. So in that regard, in terms of how the government and how the company is being run, we have a say as a consumer, not as an administrator or an official or a representative, I guess you could say.
Well, but I think you overstate that power. Like those guys with money and influence, they are much more capable of affecting. If you have enough money, it's much more. Um, for example, somebody that buys uh, a large stake in a company, if they make decisions that are going to be detrimental to the financial well-being of that company, that goes against all of the other shareholders, people don't want to buy that share anymore, and that they lose value in their investment. So they don't have this power to just do whatever they want with these companies because they want to protect their investments. So if they buy a company and one example you've given in the past, and they put their friends and their family members in high ranking positions, and they're not qualified for those positions, they're going to lose money. And that's not what these guys are in the business of doing. They want to make money. I think they actually have more power in government because when they can affect policy by buying politicians. They're not, most times they're not just paying them like in the old days of Tammany Hall or something, but they can affect policy by supporting different campaigns, uh, by sending lobbyists to these different parts of government. They can have a great effect. But I have a question for you, Brian. So, for example, if why not? So, we have these environmental issues where we're concerned about uh, how much pollution is happening in the environment. Why not just instead of the government controlling those decisions, why not just inform people, hey, this is destroying our environment? Don't you think that people would make the right decision about investing in or buying from those companies if they found there was an alternative, that one was not environmentally friendly and another one was more environmentally friendly? Wouldn't we then make the decision to go with a more environmentally friendly company?
Some people would. For some people, that's a priority. For other people, it's not. For other people, the price is more important, or whatever. The made in America is more important. It all depends again on your priority of issues.
So what we're saying there then is we want to control those people that feel differently from us, and ensure that they make the different decisions, which I think is inherently less democratic. Now, maybe there's a place for that. Maybe that's right because we say, well, the majority should rule, but that's, more democratic would be like, let people do what they want here, let people make the decisions that they want. But you're saying, no, we want to control those people and say, you can't make certain decisions because we think you'll make bad ones. So the majority is going to rule in this case and ensure that you don't.
Um, yeah, I see your point, and I think there's other issues that the government does tend to make, and with federal government, state government, local government, generally make rules that all of us are forced to adhere to. One of them being that the safety of the environment. Another one would be requiring everybody to pay taxes into your school system, regardless of whether you have children that are taking advantage of that school system. And so part of the thought process is that as a society we'll all benefit, and so we don't have absolute control, and we wouldn't unless we had, as you were saying, a true democracy where we got the chance to vote. Now, in order to look at companies, let's say, of polluters, deciding, choosing or supporting the companies that maybe had a more expensive product because they're better for the environment than for those that have a cheaper product but are harsher on the environment. It becomes a little more complicated because one of the questions one might ask is the pollution from that company going to directly impact me? Or is that product being made in China or in Iowa, where I don't really care? I'm not saying I don't care, but where it's less of an impact on me. And so there's times where I'm not going to be as interested in the certain altruistic benefits that don't have as direct an impact on me. And so this is a way of saying, well, even though it doesn't impact you personally and directly, it is going to impact your children and your grandchildren and the people that live 500 miles away or 1,000 miles away. But we want to make sure that everybody is going to receive some of those benefits.
Right. So at times we may be saying, like, you're not thinking about this right. I'm going to make those decisions for you.
Yeah.
And on top of that, we may end up with certain scenarios where, well, for example, we don't have even a true representative democracy. We're also a republic. And in the republic, at times we say even the majority doesn't rule, right? For example, when we look at the Senate allows two senators per state, which is not, I mean, it gives as much power in the Senate to the state of Wyoming or the state of Utah or some of these smaller states as it does to the state of California, which is much bigger.
Population wise, yeah.
And so the founders decided that, hey, sometimes the populace makes bad decisions. And sometimes they might say, well, you know, it's going to be better for California. So who cares what happens in Wyoming? And so they made it less of a democracy and more of a republic to protect those minority interests. There were some other reasons that they did it as well, but that makes it less of a democracy than it would be in other cases. But I mean, which is fine. Like I'm not hating on these ideas. Like I like the fact that we have somewhat of a republic, and I agree with the idea that on certain issues we should be controlling what other people do, if that makes sense. So what the minority does. So for example, if the majority says, "Well, hey, we we think that you all should go a certain speed limit because otherwise it's going to be too dangerous to other people." And even though there's a small group of people out there that say, no, we should be able to drive whatever speed we want. If we want to be stupid, we can be stupid. If we kill somebody, then we could go to jail or whatever. We say, no, we're going to have a speed limit. Like, I'm okay with some of that stuff. I just think that intersection, that place where we start to infringe on other people's rights, we should be very careful. And that's, I think, a great argument for a smaller government. For example, it's fine if we want to, protect people's life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. But what that really means is difficult. So the implementation of these rules and laws to control different people, like for example, this is a perfect one when we talk about the student debt forgiveness. I mean, some people are saying it's great, and some people are saying, "Hey, you're infringing on my rights. I didn't want to have to pay for those people. I already paid off my student loans. I don't want to have to do it." And so, should the government, and some people are saying, but hey, these other people that got student loans, they're in debt, they're never going to get ahead. We got to give them a leg up. I mean, there's an argument for both sides, right? But the broader that government becomes, the broader those platforms become, and the harder it is, or the more often you're going to have to make compromises on issues. Because when the government becomes so large that they're affecting so many different aspects of our lives, then you're going to find, and when you only have two political parties, then you're going to find that you have candidates that you have to make compromises on, that you might agree with them on. You said one issue, but it could be like almost half the issues you agree with one candidate and almost half you agree with the other. Like me as a libertarian, oftentimes I feel like on financial issues, I always agree with the Republicans, and oftentimes on social issues, surprisingly, I mean, aside for some of them, I agree more with Democrats. But then I have to make compromises and say, well, what am I going to, how am I going to vote for this candidate if I have to compromise on so many different issues? You see the dilemma that's coming up here that I'm trying to represent is the fact that when it's so broad, when we have these representatives out there in just two parties, it becomes less democratic. And in some ways, capitalism becomes more democratic. Once again, I'm not saying that, hey, we should the marketplace should rule everything that we do in this country. No, no, no. There's certain places where we definitely need a government, but there is certain places where it's less democratic in our political system than we sometimes think.
And I would agree with you on some of that. I think that the two-party system is really unfortunate because you're right. You only have two options, and it's not so much that I have two options, but everybody has two options. If we had a seven-party system, well, I may be voting for that one person, but I'm also hoping that that little community out there in Ohio is going to vote for this other person of this other party. So maybe they'll get some of the the benefits of what that party holds. So we have some places have the Green Party, and some places have the Tories and all these other parties that have different philosophies. But when they create a coalition government within that, all those different priorities then get represented, which we're not getting here. I also agree with you that money plays too much or has too much power in our governments. I think I told you the story once of meeting a kid that was in a political science major in college and was planning on getting into politics, and he'd done some volunteering. He was working for the state representative or state senator in North Carolina, and he was commenting on the fact that as much as the senator wanted to work with their constituents, she had to be more concerned about the money that was going to make her electable the next election cycle, and the money didn't come from the constituents; it came from the big power. And so, yes, I totally agree with you there. Other things that are sort of interesting about it is that, people have talked about being able to boycott different companies in order to implement change within those companies. And that can happen with large companies, but at the same time, you can have very small companies that are producing a product not only that you don't have an interest in, but you might actually personally be upset that other people have access to. Let's say maybe you feel so strongly about Nazis that you think no one should be buying Nazi flags, but there's some small company that is making Nazi flags, and there's a small market. And I'm not saying that you actually do, but something along those lines. And there's enough people that are able to keep this company in business. It's not going to compete with a big apparel company, Old Navy, because there's a very small population interested in it. But a small company only needs a small number of people to keep that business afloat. There's plenty of people that make products as a hobby, as something they do for fun. They don't actually have to make a profit on it. And so you have a small market, and your boycotting of that market is not going to impact that company's behavior at all, because it doesn't impact that small market. And so that's where the analogy can sort of fall apart, because you can have not just hundreds of companies, hundreds of thousands of companies producing all sorts of different products that frankly don't have an interest in you as a consumer. But you get enough people that you can implement change at the government level. You can't, it's very rare to be able to do it with 50.1%. Usually you need like 60% of the population because of things like you mentioned with the some of these small states, or the electoral college, where you can lose the popular vote but actually still win the election, or with some of the rules in the Senate, where 50 votes on certain bills is not enough to get it to pass. You need 60 votes in order to get some of these bills to pass. So you can't just have the majority. You need a large majority in order to be able to implement change within the government, which in some ways can be a safety measure against some radicals getting in there, even a large number of radicals, and making change happen.
Yeah, I agree with that, Steph. And that was, if you bring up the issue of Nazi, of course, I was saying that, yeah, there is a place for government in some of these issues. And I think that's probably one of them. If we have hateful acts towards other people, of course, we could spend some time on free speech and what is actually a hateful act. But yeah, I think some of that stuff is necessary, that government does control us on some of those issues. But, the the other side of that would be, let's say, I think you're kind of illustrating the point in capitalism that is one of the biggest problems with our democracy, with our manifestation of democracy. So, for example, if you have some minx farmers in Tennessee somewhere that they feel like that they've suffered from imports from somewhere, from Canada or something, and they're asking for subsidies. Well, they go to their elected official, and just like you said, their elected official says, "Well, I got to figure out where the money is." And these minx farmers, they're going to vote as a block. They're going to bring a certain number of votes to that candidate, and so they say, "Well, listen, if we'll vote for you if you promise to give us a subsidy." Well, the rest of us, that subsidy is going to be some small percentage of our taxes it's going to affect us because it affects the whole population of the country. It affects us in such a small way that we're not really going to fight against it. So those special interests affect government in a way that we can't really control. So government is then making decisions that aren't in the best interest. Sure, we would all agree we don't want Nazis out there. So yeah, control that. But what the government has the effect of doing in many of these cases is they are able to get these policies and these spending programs in place that are not in the best interest of the people. They're in the best interest of special interests and of corporations that have some money to bring lobbyists or to bring money to the campaign. They are the government, especially when you make it more broad and bigger and more powerful, it attracts money from different sources. And these politicians tend then to make decisions that are not in the best interest of the populace, but in the best interests of those special interests. Whereas if we don't like a company, we don't have to support that company. Our money doesn't have to go there, but we have to pay taxes that support tax breaks for oil and gas, that support these subsidies to different farmers, all these different people that may not be in the best interest of the country as a whole, but the money is telling the politicians to go in that direction.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and it becomes complicated where we talk about the benefit of the whole versus the benefit of a small group of people, and it can also be and also when we talk about the self-centered actions of some of the politicians looking to look after themselves. So if you use that example of the mink farmers, I think it's an interesting example because many people would ask, why are we supporting the mink farmers? What are, that's a horrible industry. They're just furs. But if you said the beet farmers, that's the beet farmers in Tennessee were suffering and because of, let's say, bad weather for a couple of years or something. And then you put forth that same argument, people could potentially have a different reaction to that same story. And so, who's getting the benefit and why they're getting the benefit can really color people's reactions. Earlier, you were talking about what's my feeling on things like the EPA and the companies that are being forced to follow the EPA. And one of the things I would say is that if the people, the politicians are thinking long term, they're not just thinking about, will you benefit, will I benefit? They're also thinking about, will our children benefit? Will our grandchildren benefit? And there's plenty of people that are alive right now that would not be thinking in those terms because they're really not only thinking about, will I benefit? They're thinking, will I benefit right now? And the obvious example of that is people have their underfunded retirement accounts. And so it's not just will they benefit, but not most people, there are some people that struggle thinking about where they're going to be when they're 65, 75 years old. And so we're hoping that our government officials are able to take that longer term view, not just in terms of our lives, but generationally as well, and act in a way that's beneficial to everyone and everyone coming.
Yeah, I guess the argument that you seem to be making all the time is, well, what happens if we want to control what other people do? What happens if we think people are going to make poor decisions, even in that are not for their own best self-interest? And I think we should just remember, as we think about these things, that there are going to be unintended consequences for all of these decisions that we make. Like you said, yeah, I think these politicians, when they think about environmental policy or regulations, they should decide, well, what's the best for the long-term benefit of my children, my grandchildren, everybody's grandchildren. Like, what's what's the best decision for the population as a whole? And when you give that type of power, and I'm talking about all the power and all the decision making that we've given to our government, and what I mean by that is when the government becomes bigger and affects more and more aspects of our lives, you're going to see bad decisions being made because special interests come in. That is such a great example because when we look at what's happened with our environmental policy over the last, 50 years, nuclear power would have had a much smaller effect on our carbon footprint. It would have drastically improved uh, the decisions that we made to and it would have been much more green to go nuclear than it was to focus on oil and gas and coal. But that's what we focused on. They made horrible decisions, and a lot of that was probably made with good intentions and from decisions or information that was given to them by oil and gas and coal lobbyists. They made terrible decisions because the more power that you give to government, the more they're going to be affected by these special interests. So yeah, I don't think that they're going to do a very good job of deciding those things for us. They're going to make mistakes. And I think that's the key argument for a libertarian and for somebody who's talking about small government is we don't want to give them too many options to control what everybody else is doing because they oftentimes make mistakes. That doesn't say that there's not a place for it. We don't want hate speech. We don't want violence against other people. We don't want polluting people's waterways and those types of things. But we should be very careful because the more power we give them, the more we're inviting influence from special interests and people with money and power.
And in that point, I would agree with you. When you have an individual making decisions for themselves or even decisions for their family, they can only impact themselves and their family. When you put someone, whether it's the president of the United States, the CEO of a company, where they're now making decisions for a large group of people, it's going to impact a lot of people beyond their immediate sphere. But there are some decisions that need to be made at that level. And I hear what you're saying, that you don't want them making the decisions. I believe what you're saying is the decisions they should be making in government are the decisions that are the hardest to mess up or that have the smallest impact on our lives. Things like speed limits, things like hate speech, things like stopping people from murdering and stealing. Does that sum it up?
Well, it does kind of sum it up, but like the smallest impact on our lives, I don't know if is the right way to phrase it. Yeah, government should be only making decisions, and it should be very specific that protect our life, liberty, and pursuit of happiness. And we at times are going to have to accept that people are going to do things that we don't like and that we disagree with. And we should allow them to do that because that's what freedom is. We have freedom and democracy. And I think with a democracy, even if the majority says, hey, you shouldn't be allowed to drink, maybe freedom is more important. And we should say, well, you can make poor decisions. If I think that's a poor decision, I should say, well, they can make poor decisions if they want, but because freedom has to kind of still exist with a democracy.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and we're just about out of time, so I'm going to leave it there. But it might be. I think I would like to, if you're cool with this, have a deeper conversation about a libertarian's perspective on the government's role, because I would like to look at things like drug use, prostitution. Look at some of those things, because obviously, though, the moral issues and the decisions that might cause personal harm and harm to others are things that I think that it would be good to break into. Is that cool with you?
Yeah.
All right, cool. All right, so I feel like that was a good conversation. Looking forward to the next one now.
Okay.
All right.
Me too. Thanks, Brian.
Yep. See you, Colin.
Okay.
We hope you learned something in this episode of Brother versus Brother, a podcast about difficult conversations. We also hope that you enjoyed it enough to subscribe to the podcast. You can help us by spreading the word. Share this episode on your favorite social media so that others will have an opportunity to experience it as well. You can also support us by donating through Patreon. This information and more can be found on our website, broconvo.com, and on our various social media accounts. Thank you.